Alrighty guys, welcome back to another little video where today we're going to be looking at something I think people are going to enjoy. And that is not my R9 290. This is an AM3 motherboard from ASRock, rocking an FX 6100. Let's get into it. Okay guys, so let me first and foremost by saying thank you very much for coming by, thank you very much for watching, definitely leave a like, comment, subscribe, yada yada, all that fun stuff. Let's get into the real meat and potatoes of this video because honestly this has been taking me so long to get out because of everything happening in life right now. Thank you COVID, shoot me. Okay, so this is an ASRock A90 or 970? Let's see, 970A G-3.1. This is an AM3 Plus motherboard. And this combo that I got, now, of course not graphics card or memory, but the CPU and motherboard that I got, I actually picked up for $70. Someone came forward and said, hey, I got this for sale, you want it? It works great, works fine, upgraded, don't really care about it anymore. So I got a CPU and motherboard for 70 bucks. And I thought, what the heck, of course, I'd love to take something, or I'd like to take a look at something like this for my channel, because I know there's a lot of people that still really like the AM3 Plus motherboard, being the FX series processors. And a lot of people talking about how great they are, and that, oh, they're a great alternative if you can't find Ryzen. Y'all are nuts. Let me make one thing perfectly clear here. This stuff is not Ryzen. I need to make this perfectly and plainly clear. Just because it's AMD does not make it good. Just because it's AMD does not make it Ryzen. But, with that being said, this actually didn't perform badly. Now, let me make one thing perfectly clear. This thing has been, it'll pretty much be outperformed by X58, X79, LGA 1155, LGA 1156, actually. LGA 1150, obviously, most modern Intel platforms will completely destroy the FX series CPUs. But that does not mean that these things are bad. Let me talk about that. Okay, so the FX 6100 is a 6-core, 6-threaded CPU. Okay, 6-core. It is a 3+3 core essentially designed with 6 threads, and the cores do not perform really up to, well, what most people would consider like up to standard specifications. They do not perform, honestly, well at all. But there is enough cores and threads inside of a CPU like this that actually makes it usable for modern gaming. Now, let's, well, before we hop into some benchmarks, let me just first and foremost say this. I don't dislike this thing. I actually really don't dislike this entire board. I don't like this, or I don't dislike this setup at all. I really enjoyed messing around with this stuff because I was expecting right from the get-go to be absolutely, like, absolutely disappointed, I think is the best way to put it. But I wasn't. This stuff actually performed surprisingly well, especially in more modern titles, where there was only one title, which, to tell you the truth, wasn't exactly a surprise to me. There's only one title that the system could not run, and that was with the R9 290, 16 gigs of 1600 hertz or 1600 megahertz RAM, 16 gigabytes of it, and the FX 6100. Now, please remember, the FX 61, 81, and 41 were the first generations. Those were the bulldozer CPUs. There are the pile driver CPUs, which are the 83, 80, or 63, and 43. Now, there's also like the 9590, which is their flagship, but I wouldn't recommend putting it on a motherboard like this because the VRMs are not designed for that kind of power. These things run hot, these things run power hungry, but these things actually don't perform as bad as what essentially they used to, and that is partially thanks to Ryzen. So, let's hop into some benchmarks and I can show you what I mean. Alright guys, and before we get into the benchmarks, let me just add a few things here. The CPU is overclocked to 4.2 gigahertz using the ASRock's built-in overclocking features on their motherboard. The graphics card that we were using was the R9 290, so really not a superly overly powerful graphics card, but it really didn't matter in the end. You'll see why later. And then all of the footage that you're going to be seeing on screen is from my main rig. I did not record any of the footage with the FX rig. And with that being said, let's get into the benchmarks. Okay, so first benchmark. I ran Cinebench R15 and R20. For Cinebench R15, it got a 479. Yeah. For Cinebench R20, it got a 960. Yeah. This is supposedly a 6-core CPU, and it performs closer to a 4-core, 4-threaded CPU. But actually, I mean, there's really no but here. It's not a really fast CPU. Going into now some more synthetic benchmarks, we have 3D Mark Firestrike. Now, 3D Mark Firestrike got an 8,352, which yet again is significantly lower for the R9 290 than what I would normally see with, say, something like an X56 or an X5680, or an X5690, or a W3680 with a little bit of an overclock, being on the X58 platform. On X58, typically I'll see about an 11,000, and in this case we saw an 8,300. So that should kind of give you a general idea of how far the CPU is holding it back. We go to 3D Mark Skydiver. We got a 19,605. A less CPU dependent game, or a less CPU dependent benchmark. Still though, really not a great score. And for 3D Mark Time Spy, 3,427. Now this one is almost entirely GPU dependent, and the CPU didn't play a huge role in that. So that's the kind of score I would be expecting to see from the R9 290. So now let's get into real games, because synthetics really don't give it a fighting chance. Synthetics really don't give it the justice. Now, let me make one thing perfectly clear. I was not expecting some of these results. So, first game I tested was CSGO. CSGO came back with about 110 average. It bounced between about 110 and about 125 on a bot match on Dust 2, which really surprised me, because while that is not the greatest frame rate in the world, and I see significantly better, yet again with like X58 or X79, it really wasn't bad. It was very playable, and I could genuinely see this being used as like a competitive Counter-Strike machine. I would have no problem playing Counter-Strike on this machine. The next game that I tested, yet again, another one of my favorites that I always go back to testing, was Grim Dawn. This system gave me a smoother FPS than what I otherwise get on any of my Intel machines. And we're talking all the way up to my i5, my 5th gen i5 laptop, or my E5 1650 V2, which is my X79 base CPU. It was surprisingly smooth, with very little stutter, very little jarring. Now, yes, there was the average frame drops, where it normally would frame drop on like any CPU, but that's just the game's somewhat lackluster optimizations. But a surprisingly good experience. Now for the one that genuinely blew my mind. Call of Duty Warzone. Call of Duty Warzone came back with an average FPS of 55, and was incredibly playable. Now, let me make one thing perfectly clear. It was not the greatest gaming experience I've ever had, but it was playable. It was playable, and it was, well, decently smooth, even though it was only at 55 FPS. So, that really surprised me. And especially being the fact that Call of Duty Warzone is known to be a little bit harder on a CPU than on a GPU. Not to mention the fact that there are typically like 144 to 150 people in the map at the same time, which really does put a heavy load on the CPU in the early game. But it never crashed on me, and with an average FPS of 55, you'd be hard-pressed to tell me that that wasn't playable. And the final game that I tested, and yes, I only tested a few games here, was Destiny 2.
Yet again, another game that came back with a about 50 to 55 average. It kind of fluctuated depending on where in the world you actually were. But yet again, playable. Not as good of an experience as what I would be expecting with a newer CPU, either Ryzen or a newer Intel CPU, but still playable. And this is one thing that I just got to go back to. This entire platform, this entire kind of like combo deal that I got for $70. Now, for an FX series CPU, that's really not bad. Because most people really overvalue FX. I need to say this again, you guys. FX cores are not Ryzen cores. FX, being the Bulldozer and Piledriver CPU architectures, nearly bankrupt AMD years ago. There is a reason for the longest time people looked at AMD as, oh, they're better value for money, but they don't perform nearly as well as Intel. And for the longest time, with what we're seeing with Ryzen nowadays is what we saw with Intel years ago, being that AMD simply could not compete with Intel. And right now, it's on, well, the opposite hand. It's where Intel is having a hard time competing with AMD. And so it's kind of funny how the metrics have shifted like that, but that just goes to show you that just because you're down doesn't mean you're out. But guys, yet again, I need to say this time and time again. Don't look at the AMD logo and think this is going to be a great gaming system or a great gaming like powerhouse. Guys, FX series cores are not Ryzen cores. The architecture is interesting. Like, at first I kind of had a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth because of it, but ultimately the way that the architecture is designed, it's kind of like the let's put it like this. The 4100 is like a 2+2 4-threaded chip, or like 2 cores plus 2 cores, and then like the 6100 would be a 3-core plus 3-core chip with 6 threads, and then of course the 8-core or the 8001 would be a 4-core plus 4-core equals 8 threads. The way that the architecture was designed was really weird and wonky, and due to the lack of optimization, it really did not come into its own. But as AMD has gotten bigger and better, and more multi-core performance has come into play, there are more and more and more games that are actually running better on an FX series CPU than what they originally would have. Which just really goes to show you that just because it's not the greatest doesn't mean that it's bad. And yet again, I know these are not Ryzen cores, and I've said this a million times, but they're not bad. In a lot of games, it was surprisingly playable, as I kind of showed you with Call of Duty Warzone and Destiny. Both games that are very CPU dependent and very, very heavy, to the point where it'll bog down most anything that's running a DDR3 platform. Anything with DDR4 and above typically runs it pretty well, but below that, not so much. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap up today's video. This has been a shorter one, primarily looking at the FX 6100. Guys, let me know if you want me to pick up like an FX 8350 and do a comparison with that. But I don't know if I would necessarily recommend going out and buying an FX series CPU. Typically, like I said, people really overvalue these things. But it was very fun to mess around with and very fun to experiment with. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, like I said, all that fun stuff, and I will see you all later. Peace!